The Vietcong, also known as the National Liberation Front, was a communist-led force that operated in South Vietnam. While they were often seen as determined guerrilla fighters, their tactics and strategies also had a dark side that left deep scars on history. To understand how the Viet Cong emerged, we need to go back to Vietnam's long struggle against foreign rule. For centuries, Vietnam had been controlled by various powers, including China and France. The French colonized Vietnam in the late 19th century, turning it into part of French Indochina alongside Laos and Cambodia. Under French rule, many Vietnamese people, especially the poor, suffered from heavy taxation, forced labor, and land seizures that favored wealthy French and Vietnamese elites. By the early 20th century, resentment against colonial rule had grown, and resistance movements began to form. One of the most significant movements was led by Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary who had spent time in France, the Soviet Union, and China, learning about communism and anti-colonial struggles. In 1941, he formed the Viet Minh, a communist-led nationalist group, with the goal of gaining Vietnam's independence from France. The Viet Minh gained popularity during World War II when they fought against Japanese occupation. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent, but the French refused to let go of their colony, leading to the First Indochina War between the Viet Minh and French forces. The war was brutal, with guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and heavy casualties on both sides. The Viet Minh, although outgunned, used their deep knowledge of the jungles and villages to fight back against French troops. The war reached a turning point at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1945, when the Viet Minh, under the command of General Vo Nguyen Giap, defeated the French in a decisive battle. The French, exhausted and humiliated, agreed to withdraw from Vietnam. After the French defeat, world powers met at the Geneva Conference in 1954 to decide Vietnam's future. It was agreed that Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, with the North ruled by Ho Chi Minh and his communist government in Hanoi, while the South was placed under the control of Emperor Bao Dai, a French-backed ruler. However, in 1955, Bao Dai was overthrown by a U.S.-backed election by Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist who became the president of South Vietnam. The plan was to hold national elections in 1956 to reunify the country, but Diem, fearing that Ho Chi Minh would win, refused to participate. Instead, he strengthened his grip on South Vietnam, cracking down on communist supporters, Buddhist monks, and anyone who opposed his rule. This decision angered many Vietnamese, especially in the countryside where people felt ignored, overtaxed, and mistreated. Diem's government became increasingly unpopular, especially among peasants who had suffered under both the French and the new South Vietnamese administration. Many rural communities believed the South Vietnamese government was corrupt, favoring the rich while ignoring the needs of the poor. As Diem intensified his campaign against communists, imprisoning or executing suspected Viet Minh supporters, opposition to his rule grew stronger. In 1960, this opposition led to the formation of the National Liberation Front, later known as the Viet Cong. The group was made up of former Viet Minh fighters, communist sympathizers, and civilians who opposed Diem's government. While the Viet Cong claimed to be an independent movement representing South Vietnamese interests, in reality they were heavily backed by North Vietnam, which provided them with weapons, training, and supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of jungle paths running through Laos and Cambodia. At first, the Viet Cong was poorly armed, relying on homemade weapons, captured rifles, and small-scale ambushes. But as North Vietnam increased its support, the Viet Cong became a powerful force, launching guerrilla warfare, assassinations, and bombings against South Vietnamese officials, soldiers, and American troops. By the mid-1960s, the Viet Cong had evolved from a ragtag militia into a deadly, organized fighting force that played a crucial role in one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. The Viet Cong strategy relied heavily on controlling the rural population in South Vietnam. Since most of their operations took place in small villages and remote areas, they needed the support, or at least the silence, of the people living there. When persuasion and propaganda failed, They turned to terror tactics to eliminate opposition and spread fear. Between 1957 and 1972, the Vietcong reportedly assassinated between 36,000 and 50,000 South Vietnamese civilians. Many of these victims were targeted because they were seen as working with the Saigon government or the United States. The Vietcong focused on eliminating village chiefs, teachers, police officers, government workers, and landowners, as these individuals were symbols of South Vietnam's authority. By removing them, the Vietcong could weaken government influence in rural areas and increase their own control. One of the most feared tactics used by the Vietcong was exemplary killings. This method was designed to send a clear message. Anyone who supported the South Vietnamese government or worked with the Americans would face severe consequences. These killings were often carried out publicly in front of entire villages to maximize fear. Victims were sometimes shot, hanged, or even buried alive, while the villagers were forced to watch. In some cases, their bodies were left on roadsides or displayed in marketplaces as warnings. The Vietcong also targeted landowners and wealthy individuals, believing that they were part of an oppressive class that needed to be removed for a communist revolution to succeed. Many were executed, while others had their homes and possessions seized and redistributed to the poor. In theory, this was meant to gain support from peasants, but in reality, it often led to chaos and suffering, as entire families were wiped out simply for owning more land than their neighbors. One of the most horrifying examples of Vietcong terror was the Doc Son massacre, which took place on December 5, 1967. The village of Doc Son, located in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam, was home to around 2,000 people, most of whom were Montagnards, an ethnic minority group that generally supported the South Vietnamese government. That night, a large force of Vietcong fighters, estimated at around 600 men, attacked the village. The Vietcong believed that the villagers had been cooperating with American and South Vietnamese forces, providing them with intelligence and shelter. As punishment, they carried out a brutal assault that lasted for hours. The attackers used flamethrowers to set homes on fire, burning people alive as they slept. Villagers who tried to escape were gunned down in the streets. By the time the Vietcong left, more than 250 civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, had been killed. Many of their bodies were burned beyond recognition. The goal of the attack was to terrorize other villages into submission. The massacre also forced thousands of Montagnards to flee their villages, seeking safety in government-controlled areas or refugee camps. The Vietcong operated secret prison camps deep in the jungles of South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. These camps were used to detain captured South Vietnamese soldiers, government officials, American prisoners of war, and even civilians suspected of cooperating with the enemy. Unlike formal prisons, these camps were often makeshift and constantly moved to avoid detection by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. The conditions inside these camps were inhumane, with prisoners subjected to extreme starvation, isolation, and physical abuse. Since the Vietcong relied on intelligence gathering, many prisoners were kept alive not for mercy, but for interrogation. Those who refused to talk or had no useful information were often executed. Escape was nearly impossible, as the camps were hidden in remote jungles, guarded heavily, and surrounded by traps, such as punji stakes, tripwires, and pit traps. One of the most feared torture methods used in these camps was the tiger cage. This was a tiny, cramped cage, often made of bamboo or metal, where prisoners were locked up for days or weeks at a time. The cages were designed to restrict movement, forcing prisoners into painful, unnatural positions. These cages were often left out in the open, exposing captives to the blazing sun, monsoon rains, and relentless swarms of insects. Many prisoners developed severe blisters, infections, and heat exhaustion due to prolonged exposure. Other forms of torture included beatings with bamboo sticks or rifle butts, where prisoners were repeatedly struck on their joints, ribs, and backs until they could barely move. Some captives were hung by their arms or feet for hours, causing excruciating pain and sometimes permanent nerve damage. Prisoners had water forcibly poured down their noses and throats, creating the sensation of drowning, similar to modern-day waterboarding. Some were locked in wooden or metal boxes, too small to sit or lie down. These boxes were sealed shut, forcing the captive into a suffocating and claustrophobic nightmare. While the North Vietnamese army controlled the infamous Ho Lo prison, the Viet Cong had their own jungle prisons where American POWs were held in even more brutal conditions. Unlike the North Vietnamese, who sometimes kept POWs as bargaining chips for political negotiations, the Viet Cong often treated American captives with extreme cruelty, viewing them as symbols of imperialism. One of the most well-documented cases was that of Lieutenant Colonel James N. Rowe, captured by the Viet Cong in 1963. Rowe was held in captivity for 5 years, enduring extreme torture, malnutrition, and disease. He was forced to march through dense jungles, often in shackles, and was subjected to brutal interrogations. Despite repeated attempts to escape, he was always recaptured and punished. However, in 1968, Rowe finally managed to escape, killing a guard and running to safety when an American helicopter happened to fly over. Other American POWs captured by the Viet Cong were forced to sign false confessions, filmed for propaganda, or used as hostages to demand the withdrawal of U.S. forces. One of the worst atrocities committed by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War took place in Hue, an ancient city in central Vietnam, during the Tet Offensive of 1968. This offensive was a massive surprise attack launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army on January 30, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday. More than 100 cities and military bases across South Vietnam were hit, but the battle for Hue continued into one of the bloodiest and most brutal episodes of the war. On the morning of January 31, 1968, the Viet Cong and NVA launched their attack on Hue. Caught off guard, South Vietnamese and U.S. forces were initially overwhelmed, allowing the Communist forces to seize control of the city's northern half, including the historic Imperial Citadel. As soon as they gained control, the Viet Cong began systematically rounding up civilians, South Vietnamese government officials, military officers, teachers, doctors, religious leaders, and anyone they suspected of supporting the South Vietnamese government or the U.S. Using precompiled hit lists, Viet Cong soldiers went from house to house, arresting entire families. Those who had any connection to the Saigon government, the police, or the military were taken away. Even those who were neutral or had no political affiliations were often targeted simply because they were educated or held positions of influence in the community. By the time Hue was recaptured by U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops on February 24, 1968, thousands of people had gone missing. As soldiers searched the city and the surrounding areas, they discovered mass graves, one after another. The number of victims was estimated to be between 2,800 and 6,000. Most of them were civilians, including women, children, and elderly people. Bodies were found in several locations around Hue, including Dam Mai Creek, where over 300 bodies were uncovered, the Phu Cam Canal, where hundreds more were dumped, Gia Hoi High School, where the remains of several hundred people were discovered in makeshift graves, Bin An and Nam Hoa districts, where many South Vietnamese soldiers and officials were slaughtered. The sheer scale of the massacre was shocking. Some mass graves were so large that bulldozers had to be used to recover the bodies. Many of the victims were so badly decomposed that they could only be identified by the clothes they wore or personal belongings found near them. The Viet Cong claimed they were only targeting traitors and enemies of the revolution, but the reality was far different. Anyone connected to the South Vietnamese government or military was immediately executed. The Viet Cong viewed intellectuals as a threat because they represented Western influence and modernization. Buddhist monks, Catholic priests, and church members were executed simply for practicing their faith. Many were killed because they were seen as part of the bourgeoisie and opposed to communism. Even children were not spared. Many were killed alongside their parents, while others were left to starve after their families were massacred. One of the most horrific tactics used by the Vietcong was the kidnapping and forced recruitment of children. Many villages lived in constant fear of their young boys being taken away in the middle of the night, never to return. Parents often hid their children, hoping to protect them from the fate that awaited those who fell into the hands of the Vietcong. But the guerrilla fighters were relentless. They would raid villages, round up boys as young as 12 or 13, and take them deep into the jungle. There they were trained to become killers, spies, and saboteurs. These child soldiers were often severely malnourished, terrified, and completely isolated from their families. Many were brainwashed, told that fighting for the Vietcong was the only way to protect their country from the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies. Some children resisted at first, refusing to hold weapons or fight, but the Vietcong had a brutal way of breaking them. If a child refused to obey orders, he would be beaten, starved, or forced to watch other children being executed as a warning. The training was fast and brutal. Their children were taught how to use AK-47 rifles, set up booby traps, and plant landmines along roads used by South Vietnamese and American troops. They learned how to sneak into enemy camps at night, steal supplies, and assassinate government officials. Some were even forced to execute prisoners, proving their loyalty by killing captured South Vietnamese soldiers or suspected traitors. Most of these children never saw their families again. Some died in battle, caught in crossfire they barely understood. Others were sent deeper into the jungle, where they spent years fighting, constantly moving from one hidden camp to another. One of the most disturbing tactics involved turning children into human bombs. In some cases, operatives would strap explosives to young boys or girls and send them towards South Vietnamese or American bases. The unsuspecting soldiers, thinking the child was lost or in need of help, would let them approach, only for the explosives to detonate, killing everyone nearby. Even those who weren't kidnapped were forced to serve in other ways. The Vietcong would pressure village elders to offer up young boys as a contribution to the war effort. Families who refused risked having their entire village burned down as punishment. In some cases, the Vietcong would kill parents in front of their children and tell the orphans they had no choice but to fight. With no home and no family left, these children had nowhere to turn, except the very people who had destroyed their lives. The Vietcong was famous for using booby traps, but some of their methods were especially cruel. They created traps using sharpened bamboo spikes, often coated in poison or human feces to cause infections. Soldiers who stepped on these traps would suffer terrible wounds and, in many cases, die from the infections. One of the most feared booby traps was the swinging spike trap. This device, usually hidden in the jungle, would release a board full of spikes that swung down and impaled anyone in its path. Another common trap was the grenade in a can. This simple but deadly device involved a grenade with its pin attached to a tripwire, and if a soldier accidentally triggered it, the grenade would explode, killing or maiming them instantly. The Vietcong often hid among civilians, making it difficult for American and South Vietnamese forces to fight back without causing collateral damage. In many cases, they forced villagers to act as human shields during battles, making it nearly impossible for U.S. forces to fire without killing innocent people. There were also reports of the Vietcong forcing villagers to walk across minefields ahead of their troops, just to clear the path. Those who refused were often just shot on the spot. Despite their brutal tactics, the Vietcong and North Vietnamese forces eventually won the war. In 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to the Communists, marking the end of the war. Vietnam was reunited under communist rule, and the Vietcong was officially merged into the Vietnamese People's Army. Today, Vietnam rarely talks about the darker side of the Vietcong. Instead, they are remembered as heroes who fought against foreign forces. But for many survivors, especially those in South Vietnam, the memories of massacres, kidnappings, and brutal tactics remain.